Reading with your kids.
Hola, ni hao, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, jambo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jedley, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We're coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. Please be sure to subscribe to the show on the iHeartRadio app, on Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple, wherever you find your podcast. Today we kick off our celebration of graphic novels, comics, and illustrated books with an interview with the author of Max Meow, Cat Crusader, John Gallagher. Before we invite John into the studio, we want to let you know about an upcoming show and also a free gift that you can give to your kids and to yourself. We'll be interviewing in a few weeks Dr. Peter Solomon. He is a physicist who decided to write a really exciting book called The Stardust Mystery. This book gives families a fun way to talk to their kids about science and the stars in the universe. For a limited time, listeners to the Reading with Your Kids podcast can receive a free digital version of the Stardust Mysteries by sending an email to education@thebeamer.com. That's at the Beamer, BEAMER.com. Be sure to write Jedley in the subject line, and you need to make your request for the free book by the end of November 2020. So that's send an email with Jedley in the subject line to education@thebeamer.com to get a free digital version of the Stardust Mysteries by Dr. Peter Solomon. Joining us on the line right now from Northern Virginia, he is the author and illustrator of a really cool series called Max Meow, Cat Crusader. Please welcome to the show, John Gallagher. John, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing, Jed?
I'm doing fantastic. As soon as I saw the cover for Max Meow, Cat Crusader, I thought of my son. And when he was in fourth and fifth grade, he just loved those books. Captain Underwear comes to mind, and this immediately just sent me back to that time.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'll have to correct you. It's Captain Underpants.
Underpants, that's great. It's been a long time since my son was in fourth grade.
I know. Well, yeah, it's funny because Dave Pilkey, who did Captain Underpants, inspired a whole crew of people and of students to read. And now he has a new series called Dogman, which it's funny, if you don't have kids at that age now, you may only know Captain Underpants. But and Dogman, that sort of popularity was part of what led to Max Meow coming about.
That's awesome. I was guilty, and I've said this a lot on the podcast. I was guilty. I was that dad who would go in and see my son devouring comic books and graphic novels, and I would kind of say to him, dude, can you please once just read a book without pictures? I didn't, even though I was buying the comics for him, I was buying the graphic novels, I didn't appreciate that he was reading. That, it wasn't the Odyssey, but what he was reading, it was stories, and the time that he spent reading those stories was valuable.
Right. Well, and you know what? It's a tough thing to understand because comics are their own language and their own style. For me, as a little kid, I'm sure I had Dr. Seuss being read to me, but it was when I discovered comics and that combination of the words and the pictures that really took off for me. And I think there's a lot of different reasons why comics work for people. And in some, it connects the two. You've got that visual cue. And what it resulted for me was I actually ended up loving all reading. But I know that sometimes that takes a while before you get around to that, where you can put down the pictures.
So tell us about Max Meow.
Okay, well, Max Meow is the story of a podcasting cat.
I love him already.
Yeah, and as many happy International Podcaster Day, by the way.
Thank you.
I understand today is the day. Well, and Max has that problem that a lot of podcasters might have, which is he only has 12 followers, and he is not as successful as he wants to be, and he decides to go visit his friend Mindy, who is a scientist, and do a show. And while he's there, an evil robot tries to steal something she discovered in space, a space meatball. And what happens is Max inadvertently bites a piece of this space meatball, gets superpowers, and becomes the Cat Crusader.
There's so much to love, and it's so true. Thankfully, we have a few more than 12 followers here. But this is just so much fun. Where did the inspiration for this come from? I know you're somewhat inspired by Dave Pilkey, but the space meatball and the robot, all that. Where did that come from?
Well, I'll tell you, the Max Meow started, and I mentioned Dave Pilkey, but I was teaching an after-school comics class. And in these comics classes, sometimes I had about 20 kids in this class in Northern Virginia, and they're usually about half of them. You go in, they take a piece of paper and a pencil, they just start drawing their own comics. But I realized that about half the class were just sitting there staring at this blank piece of paper, and they were just so afraid to make a mistake. So I kind of said, let's all team up, let's create a comic together. And I was like, what's the comic somebody likes? And someone said, Dogman. And I said, okay, well, we're going to do the opposite of that. What's the opposite? A cat. Okay. And I think we called him at the time Captain Cat. But basically, we were just throwing out all these ideas, because the whole point is that whatever idea comes off the top of your head, that's not, have confidence. Give it a try. If it doesn't work, try something else. So within about an hour, we had drawn maybe 12 panels of this story where it was a cat. We knew we had a scientist. There was an evil robot. It was all the things that make comics sort of fun and funny. And the kids loved it so much that the next week they were like, what's Captain Cat doing this week? And we worked on it. And I kind of realized that, cats and a lot of these ideas are very universal. And I was having so much fun creating this story that it just eventually turned into Max Meow Cat Crusader. And kids were responding to it so well, I decided, hey, let's see if we can get a publisher for this.
This is wonderful. I just love that origin story to have been created in that kind of little incubator after school program. So much fun.
I know, I had my own test audience. It was great. And I used to be an art teacher. For 3 years, I was an art teacher at my kids' school that they went to. They didn't have an art teacher. And I said, we need an art teacher. And they're like, okay, do you want to do it? So I did, and I was very unconventional because a lot of it started with I would start telling a story, and before we knew it, we figured out what our art project was for the day. So I have to say that I learned so much about being a creator from actually talking to the kids that I was creating for. And I think there are assumptions that you make as an adult that you don't make when you're a kid. And I've learned to really respect and appreciate, the things that motivate kids to read, but also to enjoy reading.
I think you're onto something there. You said, the adults make some assumptions that the kids don't make. Do you have an example of that they can pull up?
I'm trying to think. I mean, there have been, a lot of parents probably have had that situation where they're reading a picture book to their kids when they're very little, they're toddlers. And if you read Dr. Seuss books, they have this nice flow to them. I remember having some children's books, some toddler books that I wanted to throw across the room because it was obvious the person who wrote it had not read it out loud. Mm-hmm. And I think it's one of those things that some people just think, oh, a kid's graphic novel. I'll just do a graphic novel, but I'll dumb it down. And I think you have that, but you also have situations where I know there are some books that have come out that it seemed to me that someone thought, oh, well, this is for kids because I've got less words and I've got this, and maybe it doesn't really tie in with what's interesting to kids. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I don't want to give a specific example, but there have been times where I've read books where I'm like, this feels like one of those books that a person thinks kids should like.
Uh-huh.
but it's not necessarily checking in with the kids on this. And I think Beverly Cleary, who did Beezus and Ramona, those books, she had mentioned once, she had a student say, it seems like all the books that I have to read in school make me want to not read. So I'm trying to fight that still.
I think you're right because, I know as performing for kids over the years, I never wanted to perform down to the kids. I know the kids, there's music out there that kids like, but I hate kids' music. I don't know if that makes sense, but I know even my kids in growing up, once my son got over Barney and I Love You, You Love Me, that was it. Then it was top 40s, and he didn't want to hear anything that didn't have that beat and, was accessible to kids but wasn't made for kids. And I like what you're saying there. I think it's important. I think it's important, too, for authors and also parents to think about that and just to realize that you have to make some great choices when you're either creating or buying content for kids.
Yeah, well, and you bring up a great point with the music, because I think just about every parent has at some point had some album that's playing over and over in their head. And, I think I tried to counter a lot of that with, a couple years ago, I realized my son, who's now 16, was listening to Elvis on Spotify. And I'm like, how did you get into Elvis? And he's like, Dad, you used to sing Don't Be, what is it? Don't Be Cruel, to me as a bedtime. And I would also sing Ring of Fire because I grew up loving Johnny Cash. And, where that sort of came back around was, Max Meow is a 3-book series right now. And in the second book, I actually have Max gets hit on the head. And rather than seeing like, another superhero, he meets Elvis Presley, who's his musical idol. And, I had to tie that in, but I agree with you. I think there's some real strength in, creating stuff that is universal. And I always use Chuck Jones cartoons, the Looney Tunes, as an example that they weren't made for kids. Kids loved them because they were silly, but there's a lot of things that will come back around as you watch them.
Yeah, absolutely. That was one of the things that the first time I heard somebody mention my show, that it was like a Bugs Bunny cartoon. There was all the silly stuff that the kids like, but there was this other thing going on that went right over the kids' heads that the adults got a lot. And I took that as a huge compliment because I love Bugs Bunny. But, it brings up something. I need to ask this because I don't know the answer to it. I know that you did the same thing. All those Bugs Bunny, Looney Tune cartoons, all the characters had 3 fingers and a thumb. And I noticed that Max Meow has 3 fingers and a thumb. And it's like, what happens? What's going on? Is it, all these animated characters lose a finger somewhere?
That is such a great question. And I don't know that I knew the answer. My assumption with the animation was it was just easier to animate. There's something when you see animation of characters like Bugs Bunny with 4 fingers and a thumb, something seems too creepy, I think. Well, what do they call it? The uncanny valley. It's too close to reality, but it's too weird. And I have wrestled with that. The original graphic novels that I worked on were called Buzz Boy, and that was pretty much like Batman Adventure style art. So that was very natural. But as I started doing things that were more cartoony, I wrestled between 4 fingers and 5 fingers. I looked at what Charles Schultz was doing. I looked at what Bill Watterson was doing. And then eventually I just had to say, what works. So I do the 3 fingers and a thumb. And, I don't know what it is. I think when I've drawn characters like that with 4 fingers, it just feels like one too many fingers. So I don't know if I have a really good reason for it, but it just works. And I guess that's what a lot of the cartooning, the simplicity makes it, people don't have to focus on that one extra finger. I don't know.
Yeah. Hey, as someone's been creating these stories and telling stories through words and through pictures, what drives your creative juices? Is it the art that drives the story, or is it the story that drives the art?
Well, that's again the magic of comics for me was that combination. I believe what I used to do was it always was the story for me that carried it through. And I would say that, I am not the greatest artist, cartoonist that ever lived, but I tell a pretty good story. And, I enjoy, it's sort of solving a problem when you want to get a point across. How can I do this in this many frames per page? And, what I used to always do was I would always come up with the idea in my head, start drawing. In fact, I would call one of my best friends and I would tell him the story. And then I would draw up the story in sketches and send it to him. And he would always say, this is completely opposite or different than what you described before. So the art would sometimes just start to change the story as I went. And, nowadays with Max Meow, what I will often do, because I can kind of picture what's going to be drawn, I will sometimes put a lot of the dialogue, at the top of the panel. Because that was always one of the big mistakes I would make. I'd fill up these panels with artwork and then have no room for the word balloons, and I'd have to change it in the computer. So, I'd say it's still that combination. There's certain times I picture something, like Max taking a bite of the meatball, and then there's a scene where essentially when that happens, a giant stuffed whale has fallen on him and his friend Mindy. And the whole thing was just going to end up with Max lifting up this whale and saying what becomes his tagline, which is Meowza. And I kind of just started with that drawing, and then I had to go backwards to build up to it. So I'd say sometimes it's the art, sometimes it's the dialogue, but it's always about the story.
I'm interested in the mechanic. I'm not an artist visual artist by any means. Hopefully, people think that when I'm performing, there's an art to that. But in terms of how you create the art, do you sit down with pencil and paper? Is it something? Are you creating on a laptop, or is it a combination?
Well, traditionally, I always used to draw on tracing paper because I studied graphic design in college, and we would often create logos. I'm old enough that computers were fairly new at the time. I hate to admit that, but, I remember, working on a tiny little Mac that the hard drive was essentially a floppy disk. So it started off drawing it on paper, and I would often scan it in and then, print it out with the dialogue on there and ink it. Nowadays, for two different reasons, I actually draw my comics on an iPad. Oh. And the reason I do that, the funny thing is when I was drawing on paper, I would take so much time that the art would look very clean, but it lost a lot of its life. And amazingly, the iPad and the computer has let me do things quicker and in a rougher or more frenetic style. And I think that works really well with Max Meow. And knowing that I was going to do Max Meow as their, 200 plus pages per book, I had to come up with a style that was quick enough. But what's been amazing to me is the quicker and simpler I make the art look, the more the readers seem to respond to it. So it's almost that they can get past the prettiness and get into the story.
It's interesting that you're talking about pictures coming to life and having being able to really feel that life. One of the things is as I was looking at your illustrations, is that Max is able to emote a lot of emotion, but there's subtle things going on with Max's face, but the emotions are completely different. If there's a young aspiring illustrator out there, what's that simple tip, or what's a great tip that you can share with them to kind of help express emotion when they're drawing a face?
Well, I would say there's a couple things. When I teach my classes, I often talk about eyebrows, the importance of eyebrows, and just the fact that, if you're drawing an eyebrow and you've got like a V, that looks angry. If it's, if they're rounded and look up, it can look excited or nervous. And eyebrows, looking at mouths, the best advice I ever got was to have one of those little mirrors that stands up and look at it. And even though I've never drawn photographic comics, basing your drawings upon reality are really helpful. Mm-hmm. And some of the best advice I've ever gotten is from caricature artists. And practicing drawing real people but exaggerating it helps me make my characters seem more real and emote. Mm-hmm. And that's a really important thing too, because things can look beautiful, but if you don't feel the emotion of the characters, it doesn't have that connection.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if you're not, when you're talking about capturing kids' attention, they really want to get into the story, and if there's no life coming out of the pages to them, they're not going to be able to give it back. I'm wondering, John, do you oftentimes have kids send you pictures of, their own Max Meow pictures and whatnot?
I haven't yet. I will say I've had 2 or 3. I did some classes on Facebook Live and on YouTube, when the COVID, pandemic started, because at the time there really were no classes going on. I wanted to have something fun for kids to do. And kids started emailing me some pictures of Max. And it's just been great, because what I love is there's usually always a word balloon added. Mm-hmm. And it's not just a drawing, but it's a comic they're creating. And, I would love to see more of that. Someone just suggested I should do a contest where I have kids draw their cat as a superhero. And I think that would be a fun sort of thing to do. Years ago, I had a contest when I was doing Buzzboy where I had kids send in their own superhero. And then my thing was the winner was going to get drawn into an issue of Buzzboy. There were so many good ideas that I actually tried to draw as many of these characters into the comic as possible. And the idea was all these kid superheroes had come to help Buzzboy save the day.
That's so cool. That is so cool. Now, Max Meow is a 3-book series. At the moment, are you hoping that that's going to grow?
Yeah. Max is so much fun that I would love to do more. And it's really up to the readers. If they are enjoying it, then I'll keep working on it. I have, other things I've done, and right now Max is whatever I'm working on is what I love the most. And right now Max Meow is I'm actually working on book 3 right now as well, and because you work so far ahead in publishing, and while I've been working on this, a new idea will pop up every time I'm drawing. I'll think, oh well, what if this would happen? And then a lot of times it's just different ideas, and I just sort of the ones that keep coming back in my head are the ones that I'll eventually pursue. Mm-hmm. And, I even, I have, I think 4, 5, and 6 are already planned out.
That's awesome.
And, in my head. Now, like I said, they may be completely different by the time I start drawing them.
Yeah. Do you ever do that thing where you get an idea and you write it down and then you put it away and go, I'll get back to that. And then you pick it up maybe a week, 6 months later, a year later and look at it and think, what in the world was I thinking when I wrote that down?
Yeah. It was and dreams. I used to have these dreams and I'd write down, oh, this is brilliant. And then the next day I'm like, what was I thinking? What was going on? So yes, I have had that happen and tried to just put it together in my head and just not been able to do that. Has that happened to you?
Oh, all the time. And yeah. I dread it when my wife finds those notes and she looks at it and she's like, what?
I know. Well, and I work as an art director for Ranger Rick magazine, which is a kids' nature magazine, and I never have so many great ideas pop up as when I'm in a meeting when I should be focused on something else. So I've already explained to people, like, I'm paying attention. It's just one part of my brain is doing something else, and I'll be doodling and sketching, and then sometimes I'll look at it and think, like, I don't remember even coming up with this idea, but I like it, so try to figure out how to fit it in.
That's awesome. I've had a blast speaking to you, John. Where can folks go to learn more about Max Meow and all the other creative things coming from your mind?
Well, if they go to maxmeow.com, they will be able to not only read a chapter of the Max Meow book, but we've got a video, a little mini movie promoting the book. And then there's a link to all the different places that people can buy it, from online, there's, Amazon, but there's also links, at Random House that will take you to your local independent bookstore. And we definitely, especially in this time, want to support the indie bookstores because they are often our biggest supporters, and we want to support them as well.
Yeah, and if you happen to be able to go into an indie bookstore and you can't find Max Meow on the shelf, ask for it. Authors love that when people ask for the books.
That's right, absolutely.
We've had a great time speaking to the creator of Max Meow, Cat Crusader, John Gallagher. John, thanks so much for being part of the show.
Thank you, Jed. It's been really fun.
Please be sure to join us for the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. Our guest will be Chris Iliopoulos. He is the illustrator of Brad Meltzer's Ordinary People Change the World series. We had a fantastic interview with Brad about a month or so ago. We're following up with an interview with the illustrator Chris Iliopoulos, and it really is a team, very unique situation between Brad and Chris. Typically, you've heard here on the show, authors have very little, if any, contact with their illustrators of picture books or illustrated books. Chris and Brad work as a team, and it's a wonderful team. They really enjoy working with each other, and we really love this series. We'll be talking about the two latest additions in the series, Ben Franklin and also Anne Frank. That's the next episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. If you are the author of a fantastic children's book, and it can be a picture book, an illustrated book, a middle grade novel, a YA novel, we would love to invite you to check out our Reading with Your Kids Certified Great Read program. This is a wonderful program that has helped so many authors help their books stand out from the crowd of books that are published every single month. You probably have no idea. There are literally thousands of books that are published every month. And getting your book noticed amongst that crowd is really difficult. The Certified Great Read program, it's a seal of approval program, actually. If our panel believes that your book is worthy of 4 or 5 out of 5 stars, it becomes a certified great read. And with that status comes a number of really great tools that can, like I said, really help your book stand out. You can learn more by going to our website, readingwithyourkids.com. Click on the Authors Click Here button at the top of the page and scroll down to Certified Great Read. I want to thank the folks who made today's show so very wonderful. Plus, want to thank our guest, John Gallagher. Be sure to check out Max Meow, Cat Crusader. Also want to thank my team, Alejandro Doherty, Fatima Khan. I want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. But most of all, I want to thank the most important person in this team. That's you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Thank you so much for liking our Facebook page, facebook.com/readingwithyourkids. Thanks so much for following us on Twitter @JedleyMagic. Thanks so much for following us on Instagram @readingwithyourkids. But most of all, thank you so much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.